We have an excellent panel of experts to further explore some of the issues that Secretary Trachtenberg raised in his keynote address. I call them the Extended Deterrence Dream Team. First, we have Elaine Bunn, who served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy during the Obama administration. In addition to her time as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, she has over 30 years of experience working extended deterrence issues, both in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, but also at National Defense University. Next, we have Kathleen Hicks, who currently serves as Senior Vice President, Henry A. Kissinger Chair, and Director of the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Prior to joining CSIS in 2014, she had a long career at the Department of Defense, including service as both Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and Deputy Undersecretary for Strategy, Plans, and Forces. And last, but certainly not least, we have John Wolfstall, who currently directs the Nuclear Crisis Group, an independent project of Global Zero. John has had a long career working arms control and nonproliferation issues, including service as Senior Director for Arms Control and Nonproliferation at the National Security Council, a Senior Advisor to Vice President Biden, and in various positions at the U.S. Department of Energy. So here's how we're going to proceed. I'm going to ask the panel 3 or 4 questions, and then we will turn it over to you for questions that you may have. And why don't we start the questioning with Elaine? Elaine, you have worked extended deterrence issues for Democrat and Republican administrations. So you have a pretty good feel on kind of where we are, where the allies are. So at the 20,000-foot level, how is the Trump administration doing on extended deterrence? Are the allies more assured, less assured, or are we about the same as always?
I would say that this administration's overall policy on extended deterrence is a bit confused and unclear, confusing and unclear. And I say that because I very much appreciate what Dave Trachtenberg had to say, and he was especially about being very supportive of our alliances. I think, among other things, though, what his remarks brings out, what they highlight, is the chasm between what international security experts and specialists who are appointees in the administration say and what comes out of the president's mouth. So it's, all the official documents that Dave cited, the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review, the Missile Defense Review, they all say, it's called the right things, the traditional things about alliances. They really do capture our intent to assure allies that we will have common approaches to common challenges, as much as that can be possible in democracy, so we'll have common approaches. They really could have been, those documents could have been written by any administration in the last 70 years. But those very carefully nuanced documents don't seem to reflect the, I'll call it disdain, that comes out of the president about allies and alliances. In fact, early in this administration, I debated with myself. I asked myself, do Trump tweets count as U.S. declaratory policy? And I wanted to think, no, they don't. That's just kind of off the cuff, from the gut. But the more I think about it and the way it's perceived by allies, just as surely as Lincoln at Gettysburg or FDR making fireside chats on the radio are U.S. declaratory policy, so are the president's tweets. And so I think the litany of issues that have come out of those has caused uncertainty with allies. And besides that, those very unexpected sometimes tweets or statements at rallies are more media-worthy, get a lot more press than the one-time, very careful, very nuanced, read dull and boring documents that come out of every administration. So they reverberate around the world a lot more.
Great. Kath, John, would you like to add on this?
I think that was beautifully stated, and so I always marvel at how polite we are. It's so politely stated. I would just add, to further Elaine's points that she's already made, we have a tendency, particularly in Washington, to think capital to capital, that we can reassure leader to leader, secretary to cabinet secretary, working level to working level. And that surely goes on for all the reasons that Elaine has said, because there are documents that officials in the administration can point to. There are good relationships that people have, longstanding or new. There are eager allies who want to hear these reassuring messages and translate them up. But we and our allies live in democracies with their open societies. Messages carry, and the messages of a president carry to domestic audiences here and abroad. And that reverberates. That has a whole other set of reverberations that we're not capturing well when we try to talk about these official documents or the hard work that's going on behind the scenes. And I think that's really starting to wash over and take over the way in which alliance relationships, to include with regard to extended deterrence, are actually evolving.
John?
Just a brief point, I agree with everything that's been said, but I don't think our problem with extended deterrence is just about the president's tweets. You don't start trade wars with your allies. You don't pull out of agreements that have been carefully negotiated with your allies and leave them in the lurch. So it's not just a question of declaratory policy and intent. Extended reassurance and allied management, a broad suite of economic, political, personal, cultural relationships, all of which are being diminished and undermined by the president, but the administration's policies. No doubt, and I agree, the documents repeat words that we believe and that the deep state, for lack of a better word, is trying to hold on to. But it's not just the person at the top. We do have a broad set of policies put in place by this administration that undermine American credibility, and that affects our ability to reassure and deter.
Great. Thanks for that. Kath, let's go next to you. You recently served as a commissioner on the National Defense Strategy Commission. And that group raised some serious concerns that the U.S. was losing its conventional military advantage, especially with regards to Russia and China. That said, my question to you is as follows. Do you believe that the United States is indeed losing its conventional military edge against Russia and China? And if so, how do we reassure our allies that we will meet our extended deterrence commitments in a security environment where the United States no longer has overwhelming conventional superiority like we had in the 1990s and 2000s?
Sure. I think the simplest way I could frame this issue is when people talk about defense in the United States, we tend to talk about more or less, more money, less money, bigger force, lesser force, size. The reality of the situation today is much less about that than about how we are spending and how we are modernizing. And here you intersect the issue of how the Chinese and Russians are themselves adapting to the world as it is. And they are starting to pace us in many significant areas. So you can think about things that will feel very familiar, like cyberspace, where I think most people recognize that the Russians and Chinese are advancing pretty significantly. Space, very concerning. We, of course, know, and Dave Trachtenberg did a nice job of highlighting what they're doing in the nuclear space, particularly Russia. But what we're starting to see is that they are gaining capability, sort of, if you will, niche or specific capability advantages that make it very difficult for the United States, increasingly difficult for the United States to deter and assure effectively in these forward regions where our allies live and where the extended deterrence question comes into play. So the United States is really challenged to adapt itself, alter itself in terms of how it operates in the future, rather than just focus on recapitalizing, if you will, overstating the case a bit, the 20th century U.S. military that we've all become used to and love. And so that really is a challenge not just to the Defense Department, but to the industrial base, to Congress, and to the White House to really think about how we innovate in this next century, when so much of the challenge set is about how we strengthen ourselves in the commercial sector, how we ensure we have, for example, cyber defense through critical infrastructure, whether it's our election systems, our defense industrial base, our energy sector, et cetera, and we get a population that's educated, diversified demographically to be as innovative today, in the future as it is today, while we know the Chinese and others are investing in things like AI, et cetera. So that's a very broad brush way of saying that we have these regional challenges playing out in both the Russia case and the China case. They are a bit different, but they have some common characteristics centered around missile capabilities, jamming capabilities, and the ability or the seeking of keeping the United States from being able to get into a region, take down air defense, which is our traditional mode, and have superiority of the air, land, and sea.
Great. John, Elaine, anything you'd like to add?
I think that's exactly right, because, I mean, we talk about extended deterrence. People think it means extended nuclear deterrence. I agree with both of you. Extended deterrence is much more than that. And besides, I mean, there's what we do for allies, and then there's what they do, and then what we do together. And so all of it matters. All of it matters for these alliance relationships.
Great. John, let's go to you next. John, you've been a strong advocate of the United States adopting a no first use of nuclear weapons declaratory policy. From your perspective, one, why do you believe the United States should do this? Two, why is now the right time? And three, how do you bring the allies on board? You and I have both worked this issue with the allies, and you know that the allies have been very, very reluctant to have the United States adopt such a policy. So can you kind of provide us a little insight?
Sure, happy to, Frank, and thanks for having me and putting me on the dream team. I'm the bench player here. So I think no first use has to be in the mix as part of the discussion. Obviously, you have to weigh the costs of adopting that policy, and there are costs, and the benefits that you gain. In my mind, I look at the number one threat facing the United States and our allies as the potential use of nuclear weapons. Not just deliberate, but also accidental. And I think we tend to discount the inherent systemic risks of maintaining our forward deployed and our first use nuclear policy. We sort of bake it into the system, but there are real risks there, right? I mean, we have forward deployed weapons, those are security challenges. There's a crisis instability challenge that we add to. Yes, Russia has a role to play in that, but it takes two to dance, and they look at us and are worried about what we might do first. And so I worry about maintaining very quick use, hair trigger postures where the Russians and we both have to worry about nuclear preemption. That shortens the decision timeline, and especially if we're going into a post-INF world, I worry about that. So anything I can find that will help raise the nuclear threshold, reduce the risk of nuclear weapons, to me should be on the table. It's also not clear to me, given the work, and we all have experience here, we tend to say, oh, well, our threatening first use really deters the Russians and Chinese from doing that. I think we need to unpack that very carefully. We believe it to be true because we believe it to be true, but there isn't a lot of evidence that actually says the Russians are ready to attack us, but it's only because we threaten the first use of nuclear weapons that they don't. It's because of our conventional advantages. It's exactly what David Trachtenberg said. The Russians know they can't match us conventionally, which is why they have to threaten first use. Why then do we have to threaten first use? That doesn't make sense to me. We are trying, in fact, we make it easier for the Russians to threaten first use by doing something we ourselves don't need to do. I think the essential question that you ask here is, how do you get the allies on board? Can you get the allies on board? Because we all agree extended deterrence and reassurance is a critical part of alliance management. I think it depends on who you're talking to in the alliance system. If Kath or Elaine or you go and talk to the defense ministry in Germany, in Japan, in France, they'll say, of course you have to maintain your current nuclear posture. Politically, it'd be a nightmare if we changed it, and we want to keep the Russians guessing. You talk to the foreign ministry, you talk to the people that focus on arms control, the NATO relationship more broadly, the political actors, they're more open to that. And I think part of the challenge here is, I talk to my community, you talk to your community. We need to actually force these communities to interact with each other, because you can't have a sustainable alliance policy if the publics in these countries oppose U.S. nuclear policy, oppose forward deployment of nuclear weapons, and we say, we don't care what you think, we're going to keep doing this anyway. We have to constantly re-examine, is there a benefit here? And if they outweigh the cost, then we should maintain it. But in my estimation, the costs far outweigh the benefits that we get by threatening first use.
Elaine, Kath?
I totally agree that it depends on who you talk with in allied countries. And when I hear somebody say, well, this country thinks, or our allies think, I go, no, tell me who,
Yeah, right.
tell me exactly, But having been involved in dialogues, extended deterrence dialogues with allies, NATO, yes, but also Japan, South Korea, extended deterrence dialogues that are co-chaired by the Foreign Ministry and the Defense Ministry, for instance. I think it's too simple to say it's defense versus foreign ministry. I don't think that's right. I think it's the deeper one gets into these really hard issues, the grayer it is. And so, I mean, I agree with you that there's no data, there's no proof that not having a no first use policy is good for deterrence. There's no proof that having one is good for reducing accidents or miscalculations either. So, I mean, it is, having looked and relooked at this, let's see, Clinton administration, George W. Bush administration, Obama administration, it is, after looking at it very carefully and talking with a range of people in allied countries, it has come out so far that no, not a good idea for now. So I guess I don't say never. I would be a little more comfortable if you would say, what about a no first use of any kind of nuclear, chemical, bio? There are threats that we don't have biological weapons. We don't have chemical. So how do you deter really bad things from happening to our allies? And not just to us, but to our allies, without that possibility, ambiguity. I'm not there yet, John.
Kath?
Yeah, I'm closer to Elaine. I'm not there yet. I think it's a possibility on the agenda for nonproliferation. I'd put it lower down in my priorities than things like, the adding on the tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons for the United States. There are other things I would go at first. Certainly, making sure we can get a new start. There are a lot of areas I would go to first before I would think that it's appropriate to really get back to this issue of whether our lack of or our calculated ambiguity pledge or approach is wrong. I agree very much with Elaine that a lot of the rationale in the defense world has been around chem-bio in particular, and bio being even more threatening of the two, where the U.S., of course, as a non-pro priority, stays out of those types of weapons. And thus we have nuclear as the sort of the fallback. There is some debated evidence that in the case of Iraq, that there was a view that Saddam Hussein was deterred in the 90-91 period by the fear that the United States might bring nuclear weapons to bear under the first Bush administration. That's really the only case we have with some evidence that the fact that the U.S. had this calculated ambiguity policy created pause of action in an adversary. That's not Russia and China. I do think you have to tailor. But, it's more than nothing.
Great. Well, let me pose one final question to the panel, and it's a two-part question. First, what steps do you believe the United States needs to take, both political and military, to enhance extended deterrence going forward? And here's the $10,000 question. What are the potential consequences if allies begin to lose faith in U.S. extended deterrence? So who'd like to start? John?
Sure. I think the number one fundamental thing we need to do is have conventional military forces that are credible and capable of deterring attack and defeating an adversary. That prevents wars. We should have weapons that are credibly usable, that don't bring in these questions about whether or not we would or wouldn't, and we need to make that clear. That requires investments, and quite frankly, those are investments that are trade-offs between the nuclear and the conventional world. I think the second thing is we need a political leadership, including a president, who speak unwaveringly about our unwavering commitments. I questioned, in my mind, I wondered whether Secretary Trachtenberg knows the meaning of the word unwavering, because we have sent mixed messages, both by the president and in other actions, and so I think that has to change. And I think we have to get back to a place where we're talking about the broader connections between the United States and our allies, not just on the military front, but military is clearly a key part of that, but on the economic, on the political, on the cultural, on the trade, on the immigration. All of those are parts of that construct.
Great. Kath?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the strategic challenge the United States faces today, and it's different than it's faced in the past, it will continue to evolve, but there is a constancy to the fact that one of the largest asymmetric advantages we have is our alliance network. It's a force multiplier, literally. It's an economic multiplier, literally. It creates the ability to generate pressure, whether you agree, for instance, with the JCPOA or not. You can look at how the United States was able to bring China and Russia even to the table alongside allies and partners to create international action. You can take that model and apply it to something you prefer if you don't like that particular use. But the reality is we have successfully used it. North Korea sanctions, you can think of other things. That is a huge advantage to throw away. And to throw it away over loose language, more tactical challenges, which are real, from burden sharing to trade concerns. They're real concerns, but they need to be nested in a larger strategic vision. And if, in fact, the national security strategy and national defense strategy of the United States are going to frame themselves around these major competitions of the future, that is the best card we have to play, other than our own domestic solvency, which I would just add, I hope very much we find. And so that's my underlying view. In terms of the list of horribles that could happen, you asked about, I worry for a living, so I could have many. I'll try to limit myself here. Obviously, there is the concern about proliferation of nuclear weapons to these states. You can take from further proliferation, probably most notably in the Middle East is an area, but you can think of Asia, you can think of Europe, probably to a somewhat lesser extent. That's a real concern because it's fewer, the more and more countries with fewer controls creates a lot of concern about use. You can also think about sort of classic balancing bandwagoning issues, where if the United States is not a reliable partner, is not perceived to be a reliable partner, people look for other partners. This goes back to my first point. So you could see realignments in regions where the U.S. loses ground because other partners or new partnerships develop that weren't there before. And I'll pause there.
Elaine?
I just want to foot stomp something Kath said, which is that we don't have alliances out of the goodness of our hearts. We have them because they're in U.S. interest to have them. Going forward, I agree. Goodness, I agree with John. I agree with Kath. What else is there to say? I do think that continuing, there is no such thing as too much dialogue and consultation with your allies. There's no such thing. The kind of extended deterrence dialogues that did not exist in Asia, in Northeast Asia, before 2010, those need to be continued and deepened and strengthened. We need to constantly be working as allies, whether it's in Europe or in Asia, to look at, the basics. It's who are we worried about, what are we worried about they're doing, and together, how do we deal with it? And some of that is things an ally will do. Some of that are things we hope they will rely on us to do, the nuclear end of things. And then all the things in the middle that we do together.
Great. Well, thanks so much. We're going to turn it over to the audience for questions. I have only two requests. One, that you identify yourself and your affiliation. And two, you ask a question. We have microphones coming around. Why don't we start right here? And we'll take 3 questions and then come back to the panel.
Tom Countryman, Arms Control Association. I should have asked this to the Undersecretary, but it's a sincere question, not a rhetorical one. He pointed out that strategic ambiguity means that we won't say what we'll do, but we may use nuclear weapons in the event of extreme circumstances of an attack upon an ally. The Russians say they will not use nuclear weapons first, except in the extreme circumstance that their national existence is threatened. How should I, whether I'm in this administration or a different one, or just talking to people who are not Russians or Americans, explain that U.S. ambiguity is beneficial and Russian ambiguity is evil?
Go right there.
My name is Derek Boyd. The Undersecretary emphasized that missile defense was going to be an important part of extended deterrence. And I was wondering how he envisaged this working. I mean, is the missile defense to defend the United States so that it feels secure in protecting the allies, or is it missile defense which is going to protect the allies themselves locally?
Great. And one last one right there.
Jeremiah Rosman with the Association of the U.S. Army. I wanted to ask a question about extended deterrence against below threshold of conflict or gray zone attacks against allies.
Who'd like to start?
I can start as long as I can turn to Elaine on the missile defense question.
If only we had people here who knew about missile defense.
As the former Nasty for missile defense and many other things. So on strategic ambiguity, I don't think I guess I would, Tom, I'm not sure I'm with you on the premise of the question. I don't exist in a world in which I see one is inherently good and one is inherently bad. I think they're, of course, interactive. And so I think that's kind of helps you explain why we are where we are, which is this is part of why you need continuing dialogue and progress with the Russians in order to get to a point of trust where we feel like we're at a place where both sides can start to talk differently about this approach if you're going to move forward on U.S. shifts in U.S. no first use policy. I do want to say, because it did not come up, but your question hints at it. The nuclear posture review of this administration took pains to add language that is thoroughly confusing, in my opinion, on calculated ambiguity. So that is to say, Dave Trachtenberg's point about the consistency of no first use as a U.S. policy, absolutely true. But the NPR in this administration added language which causes one to wonder why. Were they trying to point to extended circumstances in which nuclear weapons can be used? They say no when asked that, but it worries me that they did that because it is a shift in position, again, if you're trying to read the Talmudic understandings of the United States. Gray zone, I'm very glad you asked about that. I meant to mention it. I do a lot of work on gray zone issues, and I think the United States is deeply challenged both at home, but certainly in terms of how it's thinking through and resourcing to integrated toolkits that go at the types of threats that, for instance, the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians can put forward. So that means things like energy coercion in the case of Russia. It means political and economic coercion in the case of, in particular, Russia and China. And that requires you to have capable, integrated national security policy. Problem right now, but also a continuing problem in the United States. The same basic challenges that have been put forward from the 9/11 Commission, the Bianco-Water-Nichols efforts that we undertook at CSIS in the late 2000s, and you can think of the Project on National Security Reform. we've had many, many, many outside studies that have made clear that the U.S. government does not integrate its toolkit well, does not leverage non-military tools well, and much of the response on gray zone challenges is beyond the Defense Department and the military, and we are rhetorically in the right place. The NSS and NDS say the right things. Very little action happening there. A lot of things to be concerned about.
Elaine?
Missile defense and importance of it for extended deterrence, and do we mean defense of the U.S. or defense of the allies? Both. And this is not, yes, Dave Trachtenberg said it, but I think this, I could have said this in the Obama administration, that, for instance, let me give you for instance, South Korea worried that if North Korea had an ICBM capability that could reach the U.S., that then the U.S. would not come to South Korea's defense. And so there are several things that we did to try to say, no, not true. First, we went and took them to a site of our missile defense, and said, okay, this is, yes, it protects the U.S., but we're trying to make sure, one, that North Korea, not Russia or China, but North Korea can't hold the U.S. at risk, and that's why this missile defense. But also remember that the U.S. has been at risk from far more ballistic missiles in its history with allies than we ever will be with North Korea. And still, we extended deterrence to allies. I mean, think about Russia, think about, goodness, Soviet Union had many more, and we still were extending deterrence to our NATO allies. The part about regional missile defense, though, for allies and for U.S. in regions has to do with, well, one, allies not feeling, especially allies who are reluctant to have their own, even conventional strike capabilities, like Japan. It allows them to do something so that they aren't just sitting ducks for the cheap shots. I think it's reassuring to their publics that there's something that can be done, and the U.S. can come to their defense. And part of the regional missile defense is also that we can take forces that may be someplace else if there's a problem in a certain region and flow them to that region to help defend our ally in the face of adversaries who have ballistic missiles to try to keep us out. And so it is both the defense of the homeland and the missile defense for the regions that can play a part in extended deterrence.
John?
Yeah, I'll take a bite of two questions. The first, Tom's on ambiguity. I mean, essentially what U.S. policy is saying is we can control escalation, we can go up the ladder, and you can't. That we believe we can dominate that escalation and control it, and that the Russians won't be able to do that. And the Russians believe the exact opposite, that they can control escalation and that we can't. And the reality is that neither of us can have any confidence that we can control escalation, which is why you end up in the 1950s and 60s with 35,000 nuclear weapons each in every conceivable form, including landmines and underwater mines with frogmen. A nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. That's the basis for stability and security. So I think, in fact, our policy and the Russian policy, they're both illogical. I understand why we have them. I understand the desire that is embodied in them, but I don't think they make sense. And in a conflict, I think they're not additive to our security. On the missile defense side, Elaine, you're right in terms of what I think David meant to say about regional and you can do things. But inherent in his argument, it really did worry me because he's basically saying, don't worry, we'll protect ourselves. A country can't use nuclear weapons against us, and that will improve our freedom of action. But what the Russians hear is, wow, you're no longer into mutual vulnerability, which they worry about a lot when we pulled out of the ABM treaty and as we're expanding missile defenses and as we're gearing missile defenses more towards Russia. That has an impact on how they respond. The net assessment on that, in my view, is not very positive. And our allies eventually will hear, I understand the desire to say, look, don't worry, we're protected, we'll get you.
Against North Korea.
Well, but that's not, in your case, you're talking North Korea. He was talking about Russia and China. I think we can agree that there's confusion in the Trump administration missile defense policy. His view was missile defense expands and enhances extended deterrence. Inherent in that argument is that we will be protected so that we can go and defeat the adversary over there. I understand that desire. That's right in the context when you have strategic stability with Russia and when there is a sense of mutual vulnerability. But as that erodes, I think that's more problematic than we are giving attention to, and one that we have to spend more time working on.
And John, what I would argue is it kind of goes back to the point that Elaine mentioned a little bit earlier. If you look at the Missile Defense Review, it clearly states that we will rely on nuclear deterrence to deal with Russia and China. But if you actually look at the president's statement at the Pentagon
Right.
on the Missile Defense Review, he said we will develop a system that will shoot down any missile, any place, anytime.
Yeah.
So we've got a bit of a
Disconnect.
disconnect.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right.
Let's take another round of questions. Right there.
Hi, Jessica Bland from the British Embassy. Thank you for your comments, particularly around the importance of messaging with allies. And one of the comments you kind of put in there was about burden sharing. One of the concerns that's come up recently has been around this cost plus 50 potential demand for US basing overseas in allied countries. My question is more regarding what your thoughts on whether, one, that's likely to actually be implemented, sort of the likelihood of it, and two, is there anything that allies can do to explain why it's important for the US to be there? It's not just for allies' benefits, but for the US benefits.
Right there.
Hi, Carolyn DeRoster, National Defense University. My question is specific to NATO, and as NATO is facing diverging priorities, some by force of geography, others by domestic political factors, what role can the U.S. play, and what does the alliance writ large have to do with its deterrent policy as it's facing this increased rhetoric from Vladimir Putin in the media regarding the lower threshold for use of nuclear weapons? What can the alliance communicate, and how can the U.S. help shape that communication?
Let's go right there.
Hi, Charlie Simpson, also British Embassy. You spoke earlier a little bit about non-nuclear deterrence, specifically with regards to hypersonics, something that's been identified by the US government as a major threat, specifically to restricting the freedom of movement of carriers in the Pacific. How do you deter that threat, specifically when you can't mutually assure destruction between the two sides?
Great. Who'd like to start?
What can NATO say with regard to the rhetoric, the Putin rhetoric? I think constancy in saying basically what we came to in the 2016 Warsaw Summit statement, which was a very clear, and it was very much aimed at Russia, and it took, about 9 months to negotiate that statement, but I think it bears repetition, which is that to point out that any use of nuclear weapons would fundamentally change the nature of a conflict. You know, high, low, a little bit, not a little. It would fundamentally change the nature of a conflict. And I think that's a theme that NATO needs to just continually, in a united way, say.
John.
Yeah, it gets to the same point. I mean, if you were to tell me what our deterrence posture and where our defense lines are with Russia and this administration, I couldn't tell you. I mean, I can read the documents, but I don't know what President Trump would do and wouldn't do, and I think there's a lot of reason to be concerned about what he would be willing to do in a time of crisis. I think the NATO alliance has to maintain the vocal nature of our deterrent statements until the U.S. can get its act together, whether that's under this administration or a replacement. And I think it does have to get to this fundamental basis that any use of nuclear weapons is unacceptable, opens up the nuclear response option, which is a credible thing for NATO to say, which is, again, why I think no first use is part of this discussion. I think it lacks credibility to say we will initiate a nuclear war with a nuclear power. What I want to make sure we have the ability to do is to defeat any power on a conventional basis. If they want to cross the nuclear threshold and take on the responsibility and the consequence of that, we don't want that, but we're prepared to respond to that, and that's credible. So I think we have to be thinking in that context.
Kath?
I'll take the other two. So cost plus 50, I never ever discount that something that the president says won't happen. But I think what would create a cost plus 50 reality is if there's an ally who agrees to cost plus 50. I cannot think of an ally who would agree to cost plus 50. And my favorite example, which my colleague Alice Friend always points to, is Djibouti. I think the Djiboutians would be very happy to work with the Chinese at something less than cost plus 50 when we attempt to charge them for our presence there at plus 50%, which is what cost plus 50 is. So I don't think it's a reality. The president has, or the administration has attempted to clarify that the president was talking about the Pacific when he said that, not about Europe. The only way I can interpret that is because there are active negotiations right now about U.S.-South Korean cost sharing going on, and perhaps that was the context in which it was occurring. So I think more at risk in the near term is how the U.S. renegotiate, what the U.S. is willing to put on the table. I should say more explicitly what the president is willing to put on the table with regard to extended U.S. presence and capabilities on the Korean Peninsula, and what the cost arrangement is around that. How can the U.S. then, related to it, you asked, how can the U.S. express itself better in this? I mean, 1,000 ways to Sunday. The United States has had trouble being strategic about this issue across the aisle and for decades. In the 1980s, I remember, and the early 90s, dealing with sort of, really the early 90s, dealing with sort of the left in the United States focused on the peace dividend coming out of the Cold War, and a big part of that was bringing the troops home, if you will, and that the dollars would flow back. When you go fast forward, I mean, there's many other examples, but fast forward to the removal or the reduction of U.S. Army forces in Europe on the Obama administration, which I was deeply involved in those decisions and discussions, and there was a very strong congressional push in the United States for to make sure that the forces didn't, as we reduced the size of the Army after Afghanistan, that we weren't pulling those primarily from districts in the United States. The same thing, of course, plays out in the UK, has had the same problem. The Germans have had the same problem. So anytime you have a force, if you will, forward outside of your nation, there is this push to bring it back in because it's looked at as a gain for the local population. We just simply have to be more strategic about that, and we have a lot of work to do on the defense side too, and particularly those in uniform who are so credible on these issues to help to explain the issue. And we've got to get members of Congress to stop looking, and which I actually think is weirdly, perversely kind of happening because the president has made it so crass almost now that you see folks on the left and the right starting to reevaluate how we talk about this. But it is a real challenge in the United States. And a similar thing happens around, of course, the 2% debate, which is overcome all rational conversation and capability development, where we have a lot of problems as an alliance. And those are real problems, but they're not really about 2% fundamentally. Hypersonics, or hypersonic systems, I should say. Fundamentally, where this goes to the bigger issue on where is the department going. The fundamental major gap in the department right now is it has rhetoric and some goals, including things like we need to be stronger ourselves in hypersonic systems and we need to be able to counter them. And it has budgets, which put money against that. And then there's this big black magic box in the middle where, in theory, one would be doing a lot of operational concept development, experimentation, and exercises at scale in regions. Some of that is going on. I don't want to undersell what the department is doing. But the conclusion of the commission on which I serve, the National Defense Strategy Commission, and certainly the work I do in my job at CSIS, is trying to point repeatedly to this is where the problem is. It's not so much about how much we're spending, it's about how we're going to do it, and we have to change the way we think about the challenges in these regions. Hypersonic systems is an excellent example of how that can fundamentally change the way we think about how we operate. You spoke specifically about China, so I will say in the Pacific. So in the Pacific or anywhere else, when you're looking at new concepts, you're trying to think about how do I exploit my asymmetries and minimize my vulnerabilities. And I think there are some areas we can do that, I'll just say, where the U.S. can both bring to bear new technologies to include its own hypersonic capabilities, but also can change its deployment patterns, its reliance, for example, on undersea warfare, where we have a particular strength. That's an asymmetry for us, to balance out and put different things at risk for the Chinese that create that deterrent, stable situation where they don't want to try to use them.
You know, John and Kath, both of you have raised the point on the importance of improving our conventional capabilities. I remember reading an article in the New York Times about a year or two ago, and the article noted that, you know, the United States was always able during the Cold War to maintain a conventional superiority based on the technologies that we developed. But most of those technologies were developed in government labs, whether it be nuclear weapons, precision-guided weapons. But what we've seen since the late 1980s is the fact that a lot of these new technologies are now produced by the commercial sector. And therefore, the ability of the United States to kind of control that technology is limited. Indeed, if you look at some of these investments, especially in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and a whole host of other areas, the Chinese are putting a lot more resources than the United States is towards these technologies. How do we deal with that? And what are the implications for extended deterrence?
I will be very brief so Kath can collect her better and more informed thoughts ably. I mean, I think we have to be smarter. I think we have to prioritize. And quite frankly, I think we have to avoid this desire to race and match. I mean, I think we heard the right things, but I'm hearing a lot of rhetoric from this administration. The Chinese have this, we got to get that, right? INF range systems, hyperglides, the Russians and Chinese are clearing the clock, we got to get those. Why? What's the rationale? What's the trade-off? And so the example I use is we're very concerned, rightly so, about critical infrastructure in this country and cyber, right? Our systems are potentially vulnerable, our power grid, our communications grid, right? And we're saying that in order to play defense, we're going to play offense. So our nuclear weapons, we're going to expand the mission so that we will threaten the use of nuclear weapons to deter any attack on our critical infrastructure and cyber. Great. Questions about credibility aside, that's $50 billion a year for maintaining and expanding. How much would it take to actually improve the redundancy and resiliency of our power grid, of our cyber capabilities, of our space options? That's one of the things. Now, I'm not saying that we should gut nukes to build new, but we have to look at those trade-offs. And it seems to me we could be doing a lot more with operational concepts, redundancy, defense in depth, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, we'll push a button and it'll be okay.
Well, John, you know, you raise a very important point. About a year ago, I had to testify before the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Russian and Chinese nuclear policy and doctrine. I spent a fair amount on Russian-Chinese policy and doctrine, but I also spent a lot of time on these asymmetric vulnerabilities and the need to work with our allies to close those asymmetric vulnerabilities. Kath?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to what I said before, that, you know, our greatest strengths really, and they are strengths, are the degree to which we can continue to put forward or model ourselves in a way that attracts both our domestic population and others around the world to sort of strive for freedom, which is built into how we describe ourselves constitutionally, and to attract allies and partners who are like-minded and have the same views about rule of law, et cetera, overseas. So going back to that, what makes us highly competitive in that kind of a world to achieve those goals is igniting our private sector and working effectively public-private. It is not going to be a model like the Chinese have, where they have to underwrite the private sector or Chinese companies, however you want to put that, to give them state backing. And it doesn't mean we're trying to drive shouldn't mean we're trying to drive the Chinese economically into the ground. What it means is we're trying to enforce that there's an appropriate way to interact with your companies under the rules of the WTO, et cetera. So what does that mean for the United States? I think it means taking what's in the national security strategy as just rhetoric, which is a national security innovation base, which is a good concept. I applaud them for putting that forward. There has been nothing done on that. I think taking a concept like that and really putting it into action, which is fundamentally about things like STEM education, investment in R&D in the universities, as well as government R&D, which needs to go in the defense budget, for instance, that was just put forward. There's a 2-year jump in research and development that then just drops off again. So I think demonstrating a sustained investment in how we're going to get on top of things like AI, quantum, and I just want to add, there are many areas, but I really want to add bio, because we always focus on sort of the non-bio, the computing and information side, and that piece of the game, if you will, both normatively, ethically, and in terms of the advance of capabilities that's happening overseas is significant, and the economic implications. So I think that's another area where the United States has some really clear advantages that it ought to be galvanizing.
Elaine, anything you'd like to add?
I think that's right. I think that making sure that you've got the seed corn for exploring and figuring out what's possible in the future, what's possible that others are doing, but what's possible for you and your allies is a key. And we do tend to stint the seed corn.
Yep.
We do that, and I think we don't know what the future is going to look like. We don't know which of these capabilities are going to manifest themselves in what ways and with what use. And I mean, the thing about alliances is you can't say exactly what the future is going to look like, but you can say, these are the folks, these are the like-minded nations that I want to work with to deal with whatever comes with the future.
Great. Well, we have time for one last round of questions. Let's start there.
Hi, Stephen Young with the Concerned Scientists. Thanks, panel, for good answers. The 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, as you all know, said that the U.S. administration was not prepared at that point to say the sole purpose of nuclear weapons was deterrence, but said the fundamental role of nuclear weapons is deterrence, and set as a goal that the U.S. should be able to say sole purpose is our nuclear weapons are for. In January 2017, Vice President Biden gave a speech next door where he said he and the President concluded at that time the U.S. had reached that point where the U.S. should be able to say that the sole purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons is deterrence. And he added that, in his view, he couldn't imagine a scenario under which the U.S. first use of nuclear weapons would be advisable or a good choice. Does the panel agree with the Vice President's assessment at that time?
Right here.
Hi, Laura Kennedy, also with Arms Control Association, but since Tom's got that covered, maybe I'll say foreign policy for America. I wondered if you all could address China, which of course does have a no first use declared policy, and perhaps comment on are they reacting to perceived changes in U.S. and Russian policies, or are they just operating on their own trajectory in terms of their own military and nuclear modernization? Thank you.
Right there.
I was interested in your comments about how we should improve. There was a number of people talking about how we should improve conventional capabilities. It does strike me, though, that in a place like Europe, which is what I'm most familiar with, even if we had the kind of force that we had there during the height of the Cold War, because of the kind of threats that we're dealing with, wouldn't really help us much. I mean, what would we have done in Crimea or other kinds of cases there where we're not looking at sort of, the great Warsaw Pact hordes coming through the Fulda Gap. And I'm wondering what kind of measures we could use, or is there something we could do to deal with this kind of asymmetrical situation?
And let's take one more.
My question has to do with the renewal of the New START treaty. And
Today in the paper again was another story about the Russian undersea multi-megaton autonomous drone. They've also got a hypersonic system they've been testing, the Avant-Garde, and this also a hypersonic cruise missile, nuclear-powered cruise missile. Should we renew New START if it doesn't include those systems? Because they are clearly strategic systems.
Great. Well, let's turn to the panel for one last round, and also please feel free to provide any kind of last comments. Elaine?
So on the, Laura, on your question about China and their long-standing, since they first tested nuclear weapons, no first-use policy, and are they considering changing it, given that U.S. and Russia don't have no first-use policies? Is that?
Well, I guess they're saying more broadly. I mean, or if you do think there are cases where they might change that no first use fine, I guess I was thinking more broadly in terms of are they adjusting deployments, developments, and so on in reaction to how they perceive U.S. and Russia. But sure, if you think there's a chance they might change no first use, I'd be interested.
I was going to say on that. I don't foresee them changing it. There was a debate in China that you could glimpse, 10 years or so ago, where they considered there was the experts thought, well, in every case, is that the right policy to have or not? But it became pretty clear that the leadership had said, the debate's over, we're keeping a no first use policy. I assume they had decided that the deterrence benefits of not having a no first use policy were outweighed by their longstanding history, what they wanted to portray to the world on the no first use policy. I think I do see China, of all the things China does, its nuclear forces are about the least of my worries. I see them doing so many other things that where they are adjusting as they are gain confidence, that they are doing in space and cyber and AI, in other categories. And so, yes, they're adjusting, but I don't think it's so much in their nuclear forces.
I guess I see also in terms of say, in a post-INF world and how that regionally might affect China.
Kath?
Well, let me just pick up on that last point. I think, if I understand, Laura, what you're saying, so yeah, the Chinese are not bound by INF. I think the U.S., if we are in a semi-permanent or permanent post-INF world, question mark, then I think there's a question of what that means in terms of U.S. capability development or deployment, really, in both regions, and how the Chinese then react to that. But that's a cycle one would have to then spin out, I guess, which I haven't thought thoroughly through what that would look like on the U.S. side, and therefore what Chinese developments might be. But my inclination would be to believe that Chinese developments, even on that cycle, would largely be in the non-nuclear space, but to be seen. I think there was a question on global zero, or as the 10 goal, and deterrence as the only purpose of first use. Again, I'll go back to what I said before. I get paid to worry. I can think about a lot of things that worry me. And I am more comfortable having that ambiguity that you can provide to a policymaker without being able to know in the current environment we're in, where we have, in particular, the Russians highly capable and clearly adversarial in terms of many of their actions. That's where I am today. China, we covered. Conventional forces in Europe, there are definitely limitations in the Cold War for sure, and I think you're right to point that out. In the Cold War, we never had conventional superiority in Europe. That was not the line we chose to draw. The investment that would have required would have been significant. And I don't just mean the US, I mean NATO. The interior line advantages that the Russians have are significant. The ability to concentrate, or their choice to concentrate forces in that way, is significant, as an advantage to them. So what we are really looking to do, I think, in the U.S., alongside our NATO allies, is figure out what's the right deterrent mix. And that is a mix of conventional, frankly, nuclear, and this gray zone challenge set where the Russians are very comfortable going because they can avoid that conventional trip line. I want to say, because it hasn't come up yet, that one of the big disconnects is that the U.S. tends to talk conventionally and militarily, and that is not what the Russians are doing, right? We all know what the Russians are doing is they're thinking much more along a spectrum. And so we need to be thinking that way too, which is not simply how we might choose to fight, if you will, in a conventional deterrent way, but how the Russians might choose to escalate and when. And I think that's all the questions.
John, last word to you.
Great, and I know Elaine would have gotten here if she had a chance to answer all the other questions, and shame on you. Of course we should extend New START. It is the definition.
I'm shocked, John.
It is the definition of security malpractice for this administration to have been in office for 2.5 years and not even have a position on New START. Yes, we should be seeking to capture more Russian systems. Under New START, you can declare new types. The heavy Sarmat Russian ICBM would be covered under New START. If that agreement expires in February 2021, we will have no controls over it, and there will be no controls over the number of strategic offensively deployed weapons that Russia can deploy as our modernization program works to catch up. So we want the security benefits, the predictability, the transparency that comes with that agreement for 5 years, and we want to engage Russia on their violations, on strategic stability. That has to be part of the dialogue. We are operating in the blind or with one eye, and we're about to stick a fork in our other eye, which I don't understand. On China, I think, Laura, if I understand the question, it really is China going to react to what the United States is doing across the board in terms of missile defense, if we deploy INF range systems in the region? And the answer is, of course they will. What they will do, I think, remains to be seen, and it's one of the interesting questions that's come up. A number of advocates for getting out of INF have said, get out, we can do all these things with China. What's the net assessment? What does it look like in 5, 10, 20 years? All the things you worry about? I'm not sure that's to our advantage. It may be, but let's examine that before we just rush wholesale into it. Steve, I'll get back to you on the last point, which is, yes, Vice President Biden said that he and President Obama believed there was no scenario that they could envision where the United States would need to use nuclear weapons first. But they believed that that was an issue that was left to their successor because it is a presidential level decision. And I think that's where we probably all are, which is we can give our advice in terms of what the risks and the benefits are, but the next president will have to determine whether he wants or she wants to make a change in that policy with a clear examination of what that means. And I will be bold enough to speak for everybody here saying that's not something that can be done by fiat. That's something that has to be done as part of a sustained dialogue with our allies. We're going to be doing a lot of work to repair our alliances in the post-Trump era. Assurance is about commitment and capability. We are low on commitment and we are high on capability, but coming down. We need to really bank that, but we have an opportunity as we reassert our leadership and our commitment and our will to make some adjustments and talk with allies about what that might mean for their security and how to compensate.
Great. Well said, John. Well, I thought that was an absolutely fantastic discussion. You know, my key takeaway from our discussion this morning is that extended deterrence is a very complicated issue. Therefore, we need to take the time to get it right, because if we don't, it could have many negative consequences. On that note, let me thank the panelists for a fantastic discussion and thank the audience for joining us at Brookings.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.